So, another day, another show, right? There's that old saying, another day, another dollar, but if you don't have a sponsor, it doesn't really apply, does it? But anyway, it's tough though, being a small show, trying to find a sponsor, because it seems like everybody wants a return on their damn investment. Not sure what that's all about. Yeah, so anyway, I called up this one guy. Well, not a guy, company. Spoke to a guy at a company, at a corporation, really. And I was like, yeah, I've got this show. And looking for a sponsor. Are you interested? And started asking really personal questions like, how many viewers do you have? I didn't want to tell him it was just you and me. That didn't sound too good. I sort of hemmed and hawed. I was like, sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. He just sort of paused, and he's like, what the hell does that mean? I mean, it's true though, sometimes more, sometimes less. There's you and me. I'm sure you don't watch every show, and I know sure as hell I don't watch every show. So sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. Well, we went back and forth like this for about 10 minutes, and I was trying to avoid telling him the god-awful truth. Nobody's watching the damn thing. And finally sort of pinned me down. He's like, well, is it more than 1 million viewers or less than 1 million viewers? How do you get out of that one, right? Like, it's a little bit less. Anyway, the show tonight we have David Berens. David Berens lives in Knoxville, Tennessee, but he yearns for the ocean, sunny shores of Florida. He writes what's known as, it's been called Florida fiction. Zany, full of crazy, wacky characters. A lot of action, though. Thriller writer, really good guy. So let's make him welcome, folks. David F. Berens. David F. Berens has traveled up and down the East Coast and has been a tourist at every beach from Key West to Pawleys Island. Today, he calls Knoxville, Tennessee home, but constantly dreams of sun and sand and ocean breezes. He has a beautiful wife, a rambunctious little girl, and a happy little boy who remind him daily of why he is alive. Someday, he hopes he'll be able to enjoy writing his books with a view of the ocean. David Berens joins us now. David, thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely, Craig. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So your heart is obviously where the ocean is. What are you doing in Knoxville?
Well, I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and my dad at the time worked in insurance. And when he got promoted, they promoted him up to sort of a big office in Knoxville, and we loaded up the truck, and here we are. So I've been here since I was in high school, and it's one of those things where it's kind of home now, so
right.
It's hard to get away,
Absolutely. No, I know exactly what you're talking about. So what bred this love of the ocean?
Oh man, I don't know. It's just one of those things I was born with, I guess.
Yeah.
My trips, my vacations have all been to the ocean somewhere. We used to go down to Florida. We used to go to Sandestin, and then I lived in the Keys for a little while, and actually lived on Key Biscayne and on Islamorada. So it's in my blood. Now that I've got a full family and responsibilities and all that good stuff, it's kind of hard to just pick up and go be a beach bum, but maybe one day.
Yeah, that does complicate things. I tell you though, once the water gets in your blood, you're not going to get it out. On a much smaller scale, I grew up on the west side of Michigan with Lake Michigan.
Yeah.
And right now I'm living in Iowa, so we're pretty landlocked.
Yeah,
and right. I'm even in that regard, I miss the water. There's just something about being near there's nothing quite like it. So let's talk a little bit about your journey to becoming a writer. Was this something you've always wanted to do, or is it something you discovered a little bit later in life?
I grew up being a writer. I think right behind me, somewhere on that shelf there, I have a couple of books that I made when I was like 5 and 6 years old. I mean, I made them out of cardboard and paper and
Oh, wow.
drew up little pictures and things like that. And luckily, my mom kept them and found them in the attic one day. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I really did want to be a writer, you know. But and I went to school for English. Not that that has anything to do with writing, but I ended up somehow accidentally becoming a tennis professional, and that's what I kind of do for my living. And
Hmm.
never really understood that you could write and make a living at it. And you know, I did the whole query agents, query
Oh,
publishers,
yeah.
and you know, never got anywhere. And you know, it's understandable. There was a gatekeeper that I wasn't good enough for yet, and maybe I'm still working on getting past. But it was one of those situations where Kindle kind of came along and opened up the door, and I started writing again and putting things out and started reading. So it's cool.
Yeah, and, talking about Kindle and the gatekeeper, I've talked about this with some other guests that we've had on, about the amazing revolution that Amazon kind of sparked with that whole thing, and allowing writers. And what reminded me of this just now was that you mentioned not being good enough to get past the gatekeepers. And I know a lot of great writers who couldn't get past the gatekeepers, So, I mean,
Right.
I wouldn't sell yourself short there. I think there's a lot more at stake than simply ability in terms of.
Yeah.
So I think it's great that, we now have options, and has really certainly opened the floodgates to a lot of voices and independent voices that we normally probably wouldn't have been exposed to. And I can only think that as being a good thing. Your series features a main character named Troy Bodine. Tell us a little bit about that character. For example, if you were going to introduce him to me at a dinner party, what would you say?
Oh my gosh. You know, I always say that Troy is somewhere between like a Magnum PI kind of guy, Tom
Hmm.
Selleck kind of guy, with maybe a little bit of Matthew McConaughey kind of rolled in there. He's got like a drawl, and you know, he's one of those guys that all he really wants to do is go fishing, and he keeps getting messed up in these stories that I throw him into, and uh, you know, it's one of those. I sort of wanted to create an anti-hero a little bit, and
Hmm.
you know, I kind of I read Reacher and you know, Jack Reacher and some of those guys, and Vince Flynn's Mitch Rapp and all that, and so I kind of like those books, but I do also like the Florida fiction writing that is zany and a little off the wall, and you know, I thought, man, that's really, I would like to go that way instead of the perfect, you know, sort of spy thriller guy who, you know, is always perfect and, you know, always gets his man and all that kind of thing. So he's kind of this creation that when I went to Polly's Island the very first time, or maybe it was the second time, uh, it was 2012, and Hurricane Debbie, which became Tropical Storm Debbie, kind of kept us inside.
Hmm.
And we were all sitting at the table playing cards and everything, and we could see this guy fishing outside on the dock next to us, and he had a cowboy hat on, and he had these, you know, sunglasses. This pouring rain, and the guy's out there, you know, no shirt, khaki shorts, fishing, and he had this big dark black beard and dark hair, and I mean, I was like, oh man, this guy is a character, and we started just kind of, you know, spitballing who this guy is and what he's out there doing, and all of a sudden Troy Bodine was born. So it's pretty interesting.
You're talking about Florida fiction, and you mentioned a
Mhm.
couple characterizations, like, zany kind of stuff. Is there anything specific that characterizes a book in that genre? Because I've heard your books referred to as Florida fiction as well.
Yeah, typically they are thrillers, but they have characters that are just off the wall, a little bit different. The bad guys maybe don't have it all together. They don't really, you know, the main characters maybe don't really have anything to do with the murder or the crime, other than they're just around, and somehow they get tangled up in the mess. And it's one of those. It's kind of hard to define, and in fact, Florida fiction is not really a category anywhere or anything like that. But if you mention it, you know, all the sort of normal names come up. There are some Florida writers right now who are not really as, I guess, zany or crazy, but Carl Hyacint's kind of like the main.
Oh,
He's
you're right.
the big
Hmm.
big guy that writes that kind of fiction. Um, then there's a few others that are indies, that kind of dip into it a little bit, but don't get quite as crazy. Wayne Stinnett and John Cunningham and some of those guys, and Craig Hart. I think you heard of that guy.
Oh, that hack.
Yeah, that guy. I mean, I try not to mention his name in good company, but
yeah.
No, we. But that's, it's a fine line because some people kind of want a very serious novel set in a beach or tropical setting, and some people want a really wild, crazy book, and so it's hard to make sure the reader knows what they're getting.
Yeah, it's tough to, if you're especially trying to straddle a couple of genres, it's tough to figure out, and it makes it tougher to market too. I've discovered that. Like, what the hell is my target audience here?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I feel your pain.
Yeah. So talking about characters, you obviously you write thrillers, and those are often thought of as more plot driven. But you also, as we've talked about, have a bevy of great characters in your work. Do you consider your books more character or plot driven?
Oh, they started out as character driven by far. In fact, the first book is really a lot of scenes with crazy characters that I linked together. I drew them together with just a crazy, outlandish plot line that this huge cashier's check, $7 million cashier's check, is stuck in this hat, and Troy finds the hat. Well, now there's all these characters who want the hat. So it was an opportunity for me to draw on some pretty wild caricatures to have them chasing him around and trying to get this money. So it's definitely character driven. And then I learned what beat sheets were and outlines and things like that. And so I started getting more and more plot driven, which I think has helped. My last book definitely has a more solid plot. So I think it's getting more and more storytelling and less character driven.
Yeah. I found, and I don't know if this is the case with everybody, but it seems that once you get, because both of those elements are obviously important. And I think like the better you get, excuse me, the better you get at one, the better you get at the other one, because they somehow kind of go hand in hand. I know some genres are pretty clearly one or the other. But I mean, from what I've read of your stuff, you have a pretty good grasp on both of those. How do you go about creating some of these characters? Because they're interesting and zany and wacky.
Some of them come straight out of real life. Like I said, there's a guy somewhere in Polly's Island that is Troy, and it was just the wildest coincidence that we were stuck inside and he was outside.
It'd be
fishing,
hilarious.
So.
It'd be funny if one day he picks up a book, like, wait a minute, that's me.
Hey, wait, that's me. Yeah. Well, it's funny because I keep saying they vacation in Polly's almost exactly at the same time every year that, and we do. So if I bump into the guy, I'm going to definitely take him a paperback and say, thank you.
Right.
So, but, and then, sometimes crazy stuff happens, and things will happen and you go, well, that's a very strange situation, but, I'll turn to my wife and say, please make a note of this in your phone, type this out, and type this dialogue. I mean, I've used word for word dialogue from crazy situations that have happened, and my wife's over on her phone, scribbling it out and trying to write it down. But the names are something I'm proud of. Sometimes the names come from actual highway signs. I took a bunch of them from the road that goes from Knoxville over to Polly's out in South Carolina, and there are a few that show up in the books. Winchester, Boonesboro. I mean, that's an actual name on a sign. It's the two towns, Winchester and Boonesboro, and Chelsea Campobello, and let's see, Prosperity Spartanburg, who's going to have her own series pretty soon.
That's awesome.
So there's all these, and then and sometimes the name is enough to really kick you off with a cool character. You say, what if she's this or what if she's that? So they come from a lot of different places, but sometimes real life is better than fiction.
Yeah, and I know, and as writers, we often get asked things like this, like, where do you get your ideas or something. And sometimes it is hard to explain because it can be such a minute thing that would mean nothing to anybody else. So they ask you the question. I think a lot of times they're expecting some grand revelation about how you came up with this. Like, no, actually, I just saw it in a cereal box or something mundane like that.
That's right.
How many books are in the series so far? The Troy Bodine series.
There are 6 books in the series that are published. One is a sort of a free book, that serves as my magnet to help people find me, and so that one's a little bit shorter. I think it's maybe 30,000 words or something like that. And then there's the 6 main series books right now. Okay.
Do you know how many there are going to be, or is this a matter of writing as long as the books want to be written?
Yeah, these are all standalones. They don't have anything that connects them together other than some of the characters.
Okay.
So there's not an overarching plot line that carries through other than the characters do sometimes recur, and of course Troy holds it all together.
Right.
So as long as people want to read them, and as long as people tell me that they're great and they want another one, I'll keep trying to put one out.
Well, I imagine that's going to be a while because they're good books. Yeah. I understand you've recently embarked on a writing partnership with, is it Steve Moore?
That's correct. Yeah, Stephen Moore is he writes the Hiram Kane series, which is sort of got a dark noir Japanese detective kind of feel to it, and I've known about Steve peripherally for a long time. In fact, I used him as an editor for a couple of my books.
Oh, okay.
And so we've literally never met face to face, but I know his writing and I know he's really good. And I've read 2 or 3 of his books too. They're not even really in my kind of genre, but I mean, they're really, really good. So I really literally just put out the feelers to say, I've got these other characters that I'd like to do something with, but I just don't have the time. I do work actually a real, quote, real job, if you can call teaching tennis a real job, but
I sort of exhaust me.
It can be exhausting, but so I reached out and said, would anybody like to tag team with me, and I can help you with beats and come up with plot lines and things like that, and tell you who this character is and what informs them and why they would make a great series. And Steve wrote me and said, I want one. I want one. Whatever it is, I want to do it. And so I went through 2 or 3 characters with him and said, okay, here's one possibility. Here's another possibility. And he was like, well, I want both of those. Said, oh, okay. So he's actually working on, behind the scenes, he's working on 2 series. But the first that will come out will be Troy's brother, Ryan.
Okay.
And that will have a little more of an archaeological sort of dive type, go after sunken treasure feel to it. So it'll have some of the same zaniness, but it'll have a nice twist on it, that it's not crime thriller based, it's more archaeological thriller based. So it's going to be pretty cool. Yeah, I've read most of his first prequel for that series, and it's miraculous because it sounds like I could have written it.
Wow.
And so I go through and just help say, well, it wouldn't be like this, it would be like that. And, I come up with plot lines and things like that, and he just runs with it, and it's astounding. So I think it's going to be a big deal. It's going to be a huge success.
Well, that's the mark, and kudos to him, because that's the mark of a good writer, when you can take somebody else's brainchild in a way and make it sound like that person. I mean, that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, I've done some co-authoring stuff, and it can be challenging. He
nailed it. He's impressive. He's an impressive guy, and so I'm looking forward to great things with him. I think it'll be a great partnership.
Yeah, it sounds like it. What are you working on right now?
Planning those other series. Believe it or not, there are 3 going on right now. Steve was like, I want to tell everybody, and I was like, okay, go ahead, tell everybody. But I am working on 2 other series behind the scenes with 2 other good writers, and so I'm kind of the creator of the character, and I come up with the plot lines and the direction I want the series to go. And then they sort of take away the first draft and come back and say, is this where you wanted it to be? And I go through and I say, oh, well, she probably wouldn't say that, or he wouldn't do that, and create the character in the way that would inhabit the Troy sort of universe. And so basically, I've been tying all those pieces together, and I just rewrote the prequel story to Troy's universe. So actually, the Troy uh, novella, the prequel, I redid that thing top to
Oh,
bottom.
okay.
So that's kind of instead of writing the next sort of Troy book, I've been wrapping up all those different things.
Okay. As far as now, you have a quote unquote real job, and you have a family, two kids. Does so maybe this question doesn't even apply, but does that energize or exhaust you?
It energizes me. I will say that it is 70-30 energizing versus exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think every writer knows when they get to, when they start a book, it's very energizing and they're pumped and they're really writing and they've got maybe an idea of, what they want it to sound like and where they want it to go. And they may have outlines or not, and that first, I don't know, 30, 40,000 words is just testosterone and aggression and get it on the page. And then you get through that middle part and you think, is this actually going somewhere? Where do I want to go with this? And
Right.
so you have that, I say that maybe 20,000 word slog until you get to the downhill. And then it's just a race to get the words out as fast as you can. But for me, I mean, as soon as I get done with one, I fall victim to the like, oh, I want to start writing the next one right now. Instead of, I need to do some marketing. I need to tell people about this book. I need to get the word out. And so for me, it's a struggle to say, well, Troy number 6 is still new to everybody else.
Right.
It's
Because you've
not
been
new to
dealing
me
with it for
anymore.
so long.
Yeah, exactly. So I've got a good marketing plan in place with a bunch of ads and things like that going to it. And so I try to keep those things sort of the fire lit under Troy number 6, while in the back of my head, that the idea is percolating and I start, sort of scratching out some beats and things like that so I can hit the ground running with number 7.
So we're talking about, you've mentioned beats a couple times. Can you explain to the audience kind of what that means?
Yeah, essentially there are some points that a really good story needs to hit to make it actually feel exciting and feel good and feel refreshing and fulfilling to a reader. And that is sort of what they refer to now as sort of the beats of the story. And that, I think that idea came from screenwriting. There's what they call the Save the Cat. Blake Snyder wrote a thing called Save the Cat. And it's a 15 beat system that says to make a really exciting story and to make the reader or viewer get really involved, you got to hit these certain points. And I had no idea what that was until maybe Troy number 3. And so I find it and I said, oh, okay, let me see if I can craft a story that hits these points.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked really, really hard to do it on Troy number 3 and then abandoned it on Troy number 4. So I'm back around again, and I do like it because it helps me go, okay, where do I need to go with the story right now to make it work? And it kind of gives a skeleton, a backbone to the story.
Yeah, definitely. And there's something to be said for having, I don't want to say a formula because that's not really what I mean, but it kind of is because I do that, something similar with my stuff. There's a reason why it has worked for so long for so many different people,
Yeah.
And the other thing is that once you have, I guess there's the old adage of learn the rules and then break them. So,
Exactly.
Once you figured out kind of what you need to do, you can kind of give yourself a little bit of leeway on some of these things because you know where you're going with it.
Right.
Do you outline, or are you more of what they call a pantser?
I definitely outline now. I pantsed the first couple of books, and it took me, I think, 3 years to actually finish Troy number 1, and that was where I would get into that middle slog and I didn't know where I was going.
Mm.
And I would stop for a couple months and then I'd have to go back and read it again and say, oh, well, that doesn't make any sense. I did something, in chapter 1 that doesn't make sense with chapter number 5 or whatever. And so I've leaned towards, like I said, it's not actually a full detailed outline, but the longer I've gone at doing this, the more detailed I get. And I can go so far as to guesstimate how many words each beat will need or each scene will need. And it's kind of nice to come down to the computer or sit down to the computer and go, okay, I need a scene where this happens, and it's going to be about 350 words. And I kind of have a little target, and I do a little a sprint, and that's another writer term, I guess, there, where I just write for maybe 20 to 30 minutes and try to get that 300 words or 400 words or whatever. And then I can kind of take a break and leave it and then come back and know exactly where I am. So it gives me motivation to say, all I've got to do is get this, this little 300 to 500 word scene done, and then I can go to something else. And so I definitely beat more, and I do fill in each beat with 2 or 3 maybe scenes. So it's kind of, I guess it's a quasi outline in a way.
Okay. Do you have a daily writing goal?
No. I have 2 kids under 3 years old. So, and a real job,
Yeah.
So when I can get the writing in, it's usually, it has to be a short sprint. It has to be, sometimes I get stretches of an hour or 2 hours, but for the most part, I have to sit down and I cannot wait to be inspired or, ready to go.
Yeah.
I have to sit down and go, here's where I left off, start, go. And, that's where I think it's great to have an outline or a beat sheet where you can go back and say, where am I? What do I need to accomplish right now? And I can sit down and go boom and get maybe 500 to 600 words out. And I do actually, when I'm really writing a book, I probably get 2,500 words or maybe 3,000 words a day.
Mm-hmm.
So I do get a good amount of words on the page each day.
No, that's actually quite good considering everything else you have going on.
Yeah.
And I feel your pain. I've got 2 kids too. They're 4-year-old twin boys. And I stay home with them, the stay-at-home dad. And I know I have a writer friend who's tells me, I wish I could do that, stay home all day in my sweats and write. I'm like, are you kidding me? That's not at all what happens.
That's right.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, no, I'm with you. I don't have a, in theory, I have a daily writing goal of around 2,000 when I'm working on a project. But yeah. I'm pretty generous with myself in terms of hitting that goal, because you can get to the point where you're, pardon me, where you're just so harsh with yourself that it kind of drives the joy of the whole thing right out of you,
That's right. Yeah.
What is the first book, or maybe rephrase the question, what is the first experience you remember that made you realize that words had actual power and weren't just markings on a page?
My dad has always had a library. He's always had many, many books. And I can remember going through his bookshelf and finding books, at a young age, maybe 11, 12 years old, that were, quote, adult books, not adult, but written for an adult person.
Right.
And, and the writer, Piers Anthony, who is a very sort of, I guess, mid-lister fantasy, but still sometimes New York Times best-selling author guy, writes a series called the Xanth series, Xanth. And I grabbed the first one and it just blew me away. The whole story, the way it started, and it surprised you, and it kind of there's a magical land that is in Florida. And so I think maybe that's the genesis of my whole Florida obsession.
Okay. Yeah.
It's a parallel Florida that is the land of Xanth. So everything that's a landmark in Florida, there's a landmark in Xanth that correlates.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the series is, I don't know, 40 books long or something crazy now. And I've read every one of them. And I go back and I don't really read a whole lot of magical fiction anymore. And I'll make time to go get that one. And so I think that's the genesis. That's the series and the words that struck me so powerfully. And I think that was, maybe 11, 12 years old. And then, of course, eventually I went into Lord of the Rings and things like that.
Right.
And as my tastes changed, I got into the Lee Childs series. I don't read them all. My brother and I trade Robert B. Parker books back and forth. So I haven't read all of those, but that sort of crime fiction with noir and maybe a little bit of humor. And then I found Carl Hiaasen. And that's a weird story too. I used to live in Alamorada, and Carl Hiaasen lives on Alamorada, which is halfway down the Keys.
Okay.
He was a tennis member at the Alamorada Tennis Club while I was there.
Interesting.
I never didn't know who he was, had no idea he was a writer, had no idea he was and so I left. Years later, I find this book, Carl Hiaasen, and I go, wait a minute, is this the same guy? And I looked it up. Yep, that's him. No clue. I could have been taking notes from Carl Hiaasen on the court. But, I started reading his books, and those they blew me away too. So it was that second sort of experience where every word he wrote was just hysterical to me, and it made so much sense. And when I started writing, I was like, that's what I want to do.
And speaking of reading Parker and Hiaasen, the two different writers, of course, but one thing they have in common is that they're so easy to read. It just one word flows to the next, one sentence to the next, paragraph to the next, and there's never a good place to put it down.
Yeah,
and I think that's kind of key. Also, speaking of reading, do you ever go back and read any of your own stuff, old stuff that you've written?
No, I don't. And I wrote a fantasy fiction book. A dragon, elf, dwarf book. That actually was my first real, quote, novel. And I was going to reboot that series and go sort of republish it and do a trilogy out of, change the book into a trilogy and that kind of thing. And I read through it and I was like, I like it, but none of my current readers will probably get it. It would be a totally different genre, and I would be starting essentially from zero. So as much as I thought that was going to be a great project, it just didn't fit business wise, and writing to market and writing to my fans and my readers, it just didn't make sense. So I have read that. I can almost recite them word for word because I go over them so many times, and they still have typos and errors, and I'm like, how did I miss that? And I do pay an editor. It's hard to believe, but I do pay an editor to go through and fix all that. But so I don't read it much. I did go back and read the prequel, the novella, to sort of figure out how to change things. And one of the main reasons was because part of this story came from a short story that I did in first person. It's the only time I've ever written Troy from inside. So I had to go through and rewrite that in third person, and that was a grueling experience. But,
I can imagine.
But it was funny because it reminded me of things that I put in the story, and I was like, "Oh, that was cool. I didn't remember doing that." At least it was a good experience in that.
I tried to avoid doing that, going back and reading some of my old stuff, because I'm actually afraid that I'll hate it and then want to pull it.
Right.
I can't stand it, so it's just better if I just, once it's out there, I just let it go.
That's right.
What does literary success look like to you?
Oh man, that is a tough question, because 3 years ago I would have said that I have literary success. My goals have definitely changed. And I'm okay with that being part of it. When I started, not to put a fine point on it, but money was the real, goal. Mm-hmm. And, I set goals that were like, oh, I would like, I'd love to make enough $100 a month, pay the cable bill. And then I was like, oh, well, I made 100 this month, and maybe I could make, enough to make the car payment. And so it ratchets up. And now when you don't hit that, or you miss your mark, you're like, oh man, this is terrible.
I get all depressed about it.
Yeah, you get into groups where you see, Mark Dawson and Michael Anderle, and you're going, oh, wow, that's incredible. And I'm actually really, really getting into Brian Cohen's new goal of, he wants to hit 5 figures a month, and he's got his show, his podcast that's following around, his advertising efforts to do that. I've never hit 5 figures a month. I've been really, really close by complete accident. Had no ads running or anything. I don't know how I did it, but I fall short of that. I've never really gotten close again. And so I guess right now my author's success is making that 5-figure month again.
Mm-hmm.
So if I made 5 figures a month regularly, there would be no need for a real job.
Right.
So I would definitely get rid of the day job.
It's funny. Especially indie authors, I think we do have a way of moving the goalposts on ourselves, and yeah. I don't think it's a bad thing.
And that's good. I think that's healthy. Yeah, I think that's a healthy thing. You wouldn't want to be happy with, the same amount year after year after year if definitely you could achieve more. So
right.
Put the goal up higher than you think, and maybe you'll get a little bit less, but you'll still shoot higher than you planned.
Yeah, it just kind of comes with the territory. And the bottom line is we're kind of all entrepreneurs. We're all doing ourselves, putting ourselves out there, and it just happens to be tied with art in a way.
Exactly.
But it is still a business, which is, that's something we all have to grapple with as well. Well, David F. Berens, thanks so much for joining us on the Games and Writer Show. I really appreciate you coming on. I want everybody to go check out his series. It's really good. And check out his new endeavors with Stephen Moore as well. I'm sure you'll enjoy that. So thanks for coming on, David. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Craig, it's my pleasure. I appreciate it very much, man.
All right, we'll talk to you later.
All right.